Lorien has been exceptionally good at, on the one hand, dropping massive amounts of information, and on the other, revealing in such a way so as to not incriminate themselves too much as pertains to the most important details of the story. Which is to say, we have some vague sense of what's going on, indeed at times extremely vague, and yet ultimately the core of the story remains deeply mysterious to us. That is without a question a talent. Most developers are much more tight-lipped about such things for fear of leaks and similar occurrences. But this is yet another thing we can credit Lorien for going beyond the call of duty with. And there is perhaps no greater mystery in the game thus far than the question of who or what the Absolute might be, and what the connection of the Dead Three, Bane, Myrkul, and Baal to the Absolute could be. To this end, I wish to offer you a theory that I find both compelling and intriguing that could explain at least some of what we've witnessed so far in early access, as well as the many trailers we've seen thus far. But first, we have to go back to the origin of the Dead Three. Something I assume most of you know by now, but it nonetheless might be worth repeating for people less familiar with the lore. Each of the Dead Three, Bane, Myrkul, and Baal, was once a mortal man, in a time long forgotten, sometime after the fall of Netheril. They sought to achieve godhood, adventuring, seeking after powerful magic, and even slaying one of the legendary seven lost gods, absorbing divine power, and then going so far as to assault the domain of Jurgil himself and Hades, the lord of the end of everything, seeking to challenge the then god of strife and the dead for his station. The mortals, however, fell into infighting, battling each other for the position of godhood, until Jurgil himself intervened, insisting that they play a game of knucklebones, with Bane emerging as the clear winner, and taking the portfolio of strife, hatred, and tyranny. Myrkul, being the runner-up, took the portfolio of the dead, and Baal, in last place, took the portfolio of violent death or murder. In subsequent centuries, these gods became known as some of the most evil and pernicious deities in all the Forgotten Realms, infamous for the activities of their churches and followers, and a bane to all goodly folk of the realms. Many centuries later, Bane and Myrkul instigated the cataclysm we have come to call the Time of Troubles, by stealing the powerful Tablets of Fate from the overgod Eu, whereupon he cast down all of the gods, preventing them from returning to their outer planar realms. The net result of this was the death of all three gods, Bane, Myrkul, and Baal, and soon after this they were branded with the moniker the Dead Three, despite them at times being either partially alive or fully, as they are now technically quasi-deities. Now, each of these former deities suffered somewhat different fates in the aftermath of the Time of Troubles, which is worth going into a little bit. Although initially dead, Bane managed to resurrect himself in the year 1372 DR by emerging from the shell of the corpse of his former son, the lesser power Iyaktug's Vim, reasserting himself as a greater power in the realms, and remaining so until his inexplicable demotion to quasi-deity in the wake of the Second Sundering, an event I will explain in greater detail in a separate video. Myrkul experienced a very different fate until the Second Sundering. Destroyed by the mortal woman who would become Mystra at the end of the Time of Troubles, a part of Myrkul's essence managed to escape and enter an ancient Netherese artifact called the Crown of Horns. Myrkul enjoyed his existence in this form for quite some time and even found it amusing. But eventually, as was the case with many deities, after the so-called Second Sundering, he was restored to life, albeit as a quasi-deity. And lastly, and perhaps most notoriously, we have Baal, the man who became the god of violent death, aka murder. During the Time of Troubles, Baal was slain by the then mortal man Cyric, who later took on his mantle, but unbeknownst to many, Baal had seeded the realms with many of his so-called children, beings carrying a piece of his divine essence within them, called Baalspawn. And if you've ever played Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, then you would know that this is a very long story. But to make a long story short, after the final Baalspawn had died in the year 1482 DR, Baal was instantiated yet again as the Lord of Murder, though in similar fashion to Bane and Myrkul, just as a lowly quasi-deity. So now that we've established the basic background of these gods, we do know for a fact that they play a large role in Baldur's Gate 3, even if that role is not entirely clear. Each of the revealed antagonists, for example, stands for one of the Dead Three, with Ketheric Thorm standing for Myrkul, Gortash for Bane, and Orin for Baal. And the Dead Three have always been allied with each other, though not always without friction, and the complot of Baldur's Gate 3 seems no different in this regard. It's simply a matter of how they're allied with each other. And in this video, I will argue a theory that departs extensively from what one would traditionally expect. Throughout gameplay, art, and multiple video reveals, we've become acutely aware that the symbol of the Absolute, the seeming new and emergent goddess, is in fact a conglomeration of each of the traditional holy symbols of the Dead Three, joined into one. Never before in the history of the realms has this occurred, as they have always presented themselves as three separate individuals. So what could this mean? Merely coming back as quasi-deities, I'm sure the Dead Three were more than disappointed, and given what we know about the symbol of the Absolute, I will suggest that this time around the Dead Three are not three, but three in one, a tripartite deity that one sometimes refers to as a trinity. Now, lest you think this is some wacky idea I drew from real-world Christianity, I can assure you it's not. There are instances of such things in the Forgotten Realms, in particular, an elven goddess called Angarad, a personification of three separate elven goddesses, Airdrie Fenia, Hanalil Selanil, and Sehanin Moonbow, united as one, and far more powerful than any one of them is separately. Despite this, these goddesses are still worshipped separately at times, and many elves simply view Angarad as a matter of a three-in-one goddess, the same and yet different. As we see, such a concept is not entirely unknown in the Forgotten Realms. And given the evidence we do have, such as the joint symbols, the fact that they are mere quasi-deities, and the strange being called the Absolute, I believe a plausible theory to explain this rests in the notion of a new tripartite deity. Just as the elven goddesses can be viewed separately, so too can the Absolute in the form of Bane, Baal, and Merkel, or as a unity. Evidence for this can be found in the three chosen of the Absolute, all of whom serve her, but nonetheless serve different aspects of the proposed tripartite deity, embodied in the individual portfolios of the Dead Three respectively. The Absolute seen from this theory is a composite deity of the Dead Three, embodying all of their aspects, a trinity. Now, the one issue that somewhat counters this theory is the female presentation of the Absolute, but that needn't be, as deities can be fairly fluid in the presentation of their gender, and of course all this could just be part of a grand deception, as is assumed by many, that the Absolute is a hoax, not divine at all, simply an illicit trick meant to confuse and control. But let's be honest, nothing has been straightforward in this game so far, so why would the matter of the Absolute be any different? If there is divinity behind her, then the theory of the Trinity is a plausible one, given the symbolism we see, and the little we do know about the plot. I could, of course, be completely wrong, but that is ultimately the fun thing about theory crafting before release. We just don't know. And before I go, I'd like to invite you to my Discord server, where you can discuss Baldur's Gate 3 with like-minded people, as well as other RPGs. And as always, thank you for tuning in. And if you could leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, and if you could hit the bell icon to be notified of my videos, it would be much appreciated, as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.